Sex, the favorite topic in our modern world, which is obsessed with sex and sexuality because it is unsatisfactory and most of the time absent from most of the people's lives, particularly the majority of men. Of course, it is accessible, but only to be purchased or experienced vicariously through pornography. Now, the first thing to be said about sex is it's the defining aspect of being a species. A species is a group, a population group, which has evolved the capacity to share genes, and through this sharing of genes through time have developed similar behaviors and appearances, of course. So the defining aspect of a species, let's say the human species, is reproduction, because sex is a reproductive method. It has no other purpose. It doesn't evolve. Well, it acquires other purposes later on through human intervention, and because everything continues to evolve, but its original purpose is to propagate a species, and it develops for this reason two specialized types, the male and the female. Outside of reproduction, masculinity and femininity have no meaning. In fact, the human species outside reproduction has no meaning. For instance, if you claim to be above sex or have given up sex, then your identification with the human species is a tenuous one at best. All you could do is refer back to your past, where reproduction is present, and it's what determined you, it's what brought you to life. If we imagine a future, a possible future where reproduction is no longer necessary or is attained through other means, then we can no longer talk about, first of all, male or female, and secondly, we cannot talk about species. Once you identify with the term male or female, and this is true for both the MRAs and the feminist movement, then you accept, in essence, in fact, the role ascribed to this specialized type, because it has no other meaning outside of this role. Now, I'm not saying people should have kids or anything. I'm just saying this is why sex evolved. This is why the male and the female type evolved. And this is why the species, or a species, exists. And we can see this, the function of sex, in the evolution of species and the splintering off of species. For example, in order for a species to splinter off from a common origin, there has to be a period of genetic isolation, meaning that a population group has to have no contact with the main population group for a period sufficient to create a different variety of life. Through this isolation, the isolated subgroup, population group, shares genes internally, and yet it does not share these genes with the rest of the population, distributing them uniformly. Therefore, it begins to with the effect of the environment upon the process and upon them, they begin to divert from the original. For instance, we see this partial diversion in the division between horse and ass, whereas the horse and the ass can still reproduce, since the diversion was not sufficient to create a complete split. What they produce, the mule, is infertile, because the period of genetic isolation was sufficient to create a diversion big enough for there to be no true genetic mingling. So in fact, when we talk about race or breeds of a species, we are talking about a period of genetic isolation in the past, which went down the road towards a split from the main body or from other populations, but perhaps was not sufficient or long enough to create a total split. So automatically we see the power sex and the sexual reproduction system has in the destiny of a species, and we can understand why it has such a central point in human psychology, and why so many people identify with particular sexes or sexual practices. Any diversion from this original role of reproduction is a later development, and might be an evolution of the sexual act itself, where it's applied towards social conventions, or because of social conventions, certain sexual mutations are sheltered and allowed to flourish. For instance, homosexuality, which is a parasitical sexual mutation because it relies on heterosexual reproduction to propagate itself. The reason certain sexual mutations are permitted while others are considered unnatural or non-permissible within the system is because some sexual mutations are either harmless to the system or they enhance the system, the system's stability. For instance, homosexuality being the emasculation or the creation of a more effete male fits into the system's desires to create a uniformity, an internal uniformity of increasingly feminine traits. So it's becoming more and more the norm in amongst the heterosexual group. A variation of it is a metrosexuality. In certain species, particularly social species, and more particularly the primates, sex is used for other reasons, like I said, for social reasons. For instance, in the bonobo species, a variation of the chimpanzee, sex is used as a form of stress relief. Instead of conflict, this species has developed a more feminine disposition, and they indulge in mock copulation as a form of hierarchy, establishing the hierarchies, maintaining them, and relieving the stress is associated with communal living. These mock displays are also used by the wolves, again as a form of hierarchy, of display, of dominance. And many have mistaken some of these displays for homosexual tendencies. For instance, when a dominant male mounts another male, he is asserting his authority over it. He is imposing his will upon it, and in the process he is avoiding direct conflict with it. It's a very symbolic gesture because in sex the female is the one that capitulates, in effect accepting the male's intrusions upon her being, into her being, and the male is the one that asserts his will, imposes himself upon the female. And the entire heterosexual reproductive system is based on the female's tolerance. We see it in the fertilization process, where the female's autoimmune system has to be tricked, essentially, so as to accept a foreign body within her being and gestate it for a period of time. In order to accomplish this, the evolution has developed some very clever tactics where the autoimmune system is tricked, but also another tactic is the emotion of love itself, which is a form of mental inebriation, or lust, you can say, which is the more primal form of love, associated with, in the Greek amongst the Greeks with eros, the lustful love, not so much with agape, which was more the rational type of love, and was mostly associated with friendship. But there was still, even in agape, a homoerotic, an erotic element to it. We mustn't forget that sex springs out of natural processes, natural forces. It doesn't come out of the ether, it doesn't magically appear. No God creates it. It is a consequence of natural forces interacting. Therefore, the two types, the male and the female, are linked to these natural forces. That is, there's an organic element to even the idea and the concept of masculinity and femininity. In the same way, just to go off a bit, all cultures are based upon these same natural processes, and they don't just come out of nothingness, the void. They are rooted in natural processes, and they bear the stamp of these natural processes. In brief, the male is a resistant force, a resistance to increasing entropy, whereas the feminine is an abandonment, a return to the flow, if you will. And this is why it is so malleable and so much preferred by the system itself, because it is non-resistant. Male is ordering, female is disordering. In philosophy, the male is associated with God, with the absolute authority, whereas the feminine is associated with the more Eastern void, emptiness, as it is called, chaos.